On the night of March 27th, 1942, a fleet of old destroyers steamed toward the most heavily defended port in Nazi-occupied Europe. To casual observers, this might have seemed like yet another desperate British gamble, the kind that had become all too common in the dark, early years of the war. The German defences at Saint-Nazaire bristled with artillery pieces, countless anti-aircraft guns, and thousands of troops. The harbour mouth was protected by minefields, torpedo nets, and searchlights that could turn night into day. Any rational assessment would have concluded this mission was suicide. That assessment would prove correct for many of the 611 men who set out that night. But what those assessors could never have imagined was that this suicide mission would achieve something so strategically devastating, so personally infuriating to Adolf Hitler, that he would take the unprecedented step of issuing a direct order, the Kommandobefehl, commanding that all captured commandos be executed on sight. The Saint-Nazaire raid would become one of several operations that would provoke such a reaction from the Führer himself, contributing to a war crime that would be prosecuted at Nuremberg. To understand why Hitler would issue what amounted to a personal kill order, you must first understand what Saint-Nazaire represented to German naval strategy. The port housed the Forme Écluse Louis Joubert, also known as the Normandie Dock, a dry dock so massive it was the only facility on the entire Atlantic coast capable of servicing the German battleship Tirpitz. This single vessel, sister ship to the legendary Bismarck, represented such a threat to Allied shipping that Winston Churchill considered it one of the most dangerous naval units in the war. The Tirpitz displaced over 50,000 tons fully loaded, had a top speed of 30 knots, mounted 4 dual sets of 38cm guns, and could outgun or outrun any other warship. But there was a critical constraint. If the Tirpitz was damaged in the Atlantic, she would need the Saint-Nazaire dock for repairs. Any other option would force her to run the gauntlet of the English Channel or the North Sea to reach home waters, passages heavily patrolled by British forces. Remove that dock and you effectively cage the beast. The British understood this calculus with crystal clarity. What they didn't yet know was just how high a price both sides would pay when that dock was destroyed. The plan conceived by combined operations was audacious to the point of madness. Take HMS Campbelltown, an old American destroyer from World War I, pack her bow with delayed action explosives well hidden within a steel and concrete case, and ram her directly into the massive caisson gates of the dock. Simultaneously, commandos would land and destroy the dock's pumping stations, winding houses, and operating machinery. The explosives in the Campbelltown wouldn't detonate for several hours, giving the commandos time to attempt escape and, critically, allowing German officers to board the ship and investigate. The psychological impact of having enemy personnel physically standing on what was essentially a giant bomb when it exploded would prove even more devastating than the British planners anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman commanded the commandos. Commander Robert Ryder led the naval force. Between them, they would orchestrate what would later be called the greatest raid of all time. The fleet that set out from Falmouth consisted of HMS Campbelltown, 18 smaller craft, including motor launches and torpedo boats, escorted for part of the journey by 2 Hunt-class destroyers. To anyone observing this armada, the mathematics seemed impossible. The raiders would be outnumbered roughly 10-1 once ashore. The round trip covered hundreds of miles through U-boat-infested waters. The return journey would have to be made in small wooden motor launches with virtually no defensive armament. Survival rates, based on any conventional analysis, hovered near zero. Yet every man on those vessels had volunteered, knowing full well these odds. Only a few senior officers believed the mission had any chance of success, and even those thought that there was little or no chance that any of the men would make it home alive. What they couldn't know was that their actions would contribute to Hitler's rage that would manifest in orders affecting hundreds of Allied commandos throughout the war. The approach to Saint-Nazaire required the raiders to navigate up the Loire estuary. The Campbelltown flew the German naval ensign and used signal lamps to respond to challenges from shore batteries. buying precious minutes. As they made the final turn eastward for the 5-mile trip upriver, the commander ordered the fuses on the bombs be lit. The men had approximately 8 hours until their ship would blow sky high. A planned RAF bombing mission was supposed to distract the defenders, but heavy cloud cover caused most bombers to withhold their ordnance to avoid French civilian casualties. The circling planes merely alerted German commander Kapitän Zersi Mecker that something unusual was happening. At approximately 1:20 a.m. on March 28th, German searchlights locked onto the fleet, and every gun in the harbour opened fire simultaneously. The motor launches, their wooden hulls offering no protection whatsoever, began to disintegrate under the barrage. The air filled with tracer fire so thick that survivors described it as looking like lethal rain. Through this maelstrom, Commander Stephen Holden Beatty drove the Campbelltown forward at maximum speed. At 1:34 a.m., the Campbelltown slammed into the top of the massive dry dock caisson at 19 knots. 9 meters of her bow continued to lurch forward, coming to rest at the dead center of the entrance gates with its forecastle hanging above. This left the 4.5 tons of hidden explosives in perfect position to produce maximum damage. As the ship came to an abrupt halt, Beatty blithely announced, "Well, here we are, 4 minutes late." German troops immediately began swarming toward the wreck. On shore, the Commandos had begun their work. The fighting became intimate and brutal. Grenades in darkened buildings, submachine gun duels at arm's length, hand-to-hand combat in the shadows of massive machinery. What the Commandos achieved in the next 2 hours would exceed every objective. But the cost was mounting by the minute. The Commandos moved through their targets with methodical precision, despite the chaos. Teams destroyed the southern winding house, the pumping station that controlled the dock's water flow, and the northern winding house. Each explosion represented not just physical destruction, but the elimination of systems that had taken years to build and would require years to replace. The Germans, realizing something catastrophic was unfolding, poured reinforcements into the area. By 2 a.m., the Commandos were fighting their way back toward where the motor launches were supposed to evacuate them. This was when the true horror of the plan's execution became apparent. German gunfire sank, set ablaze or immobilized virtually all the small craft intended to transport the Commandos back to England. When the Commandos arrived back at their pickup point, nearly all of the motor launches were sinking or on fire. The commander gave the order for the men to disperse into small groups and attempt to fight their way to the Spanish border, 350 miles away. It was a desperate last command from a man who knew he was ordering the impossible. By dawn, German troops were systematically hunting down the exhausted Commandos. But the real revelation, the moment that would shock the Germans and contribute to Hitler's unprecedented fury, was still hours away. Throughout the morning of March 28th, German officers toured the Campbelltown with curiosity and satisfaction. They had repelled the raid, captured most of the attackers, and the destroyer wedged in their dock represented a trophy of sorts. Senior Kriegsmarine officers boarded the vessel to assess the damage and plan her removal. Dockyard workers began gathering on the dock to observe the spectacle. German naval architects discussed how quickly they could repair the caisson and resume operations. The demolition experts had set the explosives to detonate at 4:30 a.m. on March 28th. But because of what was believed afterward to be a malfunction in the detonators, the massive explosive charge detonated instead at 12 p.m. that day. When those 4.5 tons of explosives finally detonated, the results were cataclysmic. At 10:35 a.m., the Campbelltown exploded, killing over 350 Germans on board, destroying the caisson and rendering the dry dock useless for the remainder of the war. The blast vaporized everyone aboard the destroyer and on the immediately adjacent dock sections. The lock was completely destroyed and became the main success of Operation Chariot in preventing German battleships such as Tirpitz from accessing its maintenance facilities while operating in the Atlantic Ocean. But the casualty numbers tell only part of the story. The psychological impact of having personnel killed while inspecting what they believed was a captured enemy vessel proved far more damaging than the physical destruction alone. Many of those killed were trained naval officers and skilled dockyard workers who could not be easily replaced. The German response to the explosion revealed the depth of their shock. In the immediate aftermath, confusion reigned. On March 30th at 4:30 p.m., the torpedoes from MTB-74, which were on a delayed fuse setting, exploded at the old entrance into the basin. This raised alarms among the Germans. The Germans, paranoid that more devices remained hidden, evacuated the entire dock complex. German guards, mistaking civilian workers in khaki uniforms for British uniforms, opened fire, killing some of them. The Germans also thought that some commandos were still hiding in the town and made a street-by-street search during which some townspeople were also killed. 16 French civilians were killed and around 30 wounded. This wasn't paranoia. It was the rational response of an enemy who had just discovered they fundamentally misunderstood both British capabilities and British willingness to sacrifice their own men for strategic objectives. Of the 612 men who undertook the raid, 228 returned to Britain, 169 were killed, and 215 became prisoners of war. German casualties included over 360 dead, some of whom were killed after the raid when Campbelltown exploded. The survivors formed the St. Nazaire Society to commemorate their fallen comrades. A memorial erected in Falmouth bears the inscription, Operation Chariot. From this harbour, 622 sailors and commandos set sail for the successful raid on St. Nazaire, 28 March 1942. 168 were killed, 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded. The slight discrepancy in numbers between sources reflects the difficulty in accounting for every casualty in such a chaotic operation. But the strategic result was undeniable. When news of the St. Nazaire raid reached Adolf Hitler, his reaction was volcanic. However, this wasn't the only incident that fed his rage. On August 19, 1942, during the Dieppe raid, a Canadian brigadier took a copy of the operational order ashore against explicit orders. The order was subsequently discovered on the beach by the Germans and found its way to Hitler. Among the dozens of pages of orders was an instruction to bind prisoners. On the night of October 3rd to 4th, 1942, 10 men of the small-scale raiding force and number 12 Commando made an offensive raid on the German-occupied Isle of Sark called Operation Basalt. During the raid, 5 prisoners were captured, and to minimise the task of the guard, the commandos tied the prisoners' hands behind their backs. These incidents, combined with the shock of St. Nazaire, pushed Hitler to act. On October 18, 1942, after much deliberation by high command lawyers, officers, and staff, Hitler issued the Commando Order, or Kommandobefehl, in secret, with only 12 copies. The following day, Alfred Jodl distributed copies with an appendix stating that the order was intended for commanders only and must not under any circumstances fall into enemy hands. This order stated that all Allied commandos captured in Europe and Africa should be summarily executed without trial, even if in proper uniforms or if they attempted to surrender. The order made specific reference to alleged violations of the Geneva Conventions by British commandos, claiming they recruited criminals and murdered prisoners. Hitler justified this by arguing commando operations represented illegal warfare. Hitler and his subordinates knew that the order was illegal, as evidenced by the fact that only 12 copies were prepared and that special measures were taken to keep it secret. The Führer could not tolerate the precedent that operations like St. Nazaire set. Small, highly trained forces had achieved strategic effects completely disproportionate to their numbers. They had destroyed infrastructure Hitler considered invulnerable and killed hundreds of German personnel. If such operations were allowed to continue without the deterrent of execution, then nowhere in Nazi-occupied Europe would be safe from similar attacks. The Commando Order was used to kill hundreds and possibly thousands of Allied special forces and behind-the-lines operators of the OSS, SOE and other elements. Normally, they would be handed over to the SD or Gestapo, transported to a concentration camp, and murdered there. The first victims were 7 officer men of Operation Musketoon who were shot in Sachsenhausen on the morning of October 23, 1942. Executions under this order were carried out well into the dying days of the Third Reich. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, the Commando Order was found to be a direct breach of the laws of war, and German officers who carried out illegal executions under the Commando Order were found guilty of war crimes. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Generaloberst Alfred Jodl were both convicted partially for their roles in implementing Hitler's directive. The strategic impact of the Saint-Nazaire raid extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The explosion put the dry dock out of commission until 1948. The Tirpitz never ventured into the Atlantic to threaten British sea lanes and remained in Norwegian waters until she was sunk by the RAF in November 1944. Historians have calculated that keeping the Tirpitz bottled up required the Royal Navy to maintain significant capital ship forces in home waters, but these forces were far less than would have been required to hunt her across the Atlantic shipping lanes. The destruction of the Saint-Nazaire dock, achieved by 611 men in a single night, accomplished what would have required months of conventional bombing and could not have been guaranteed even then. To recognise their achievement, 89 decorations were awarded for the raid, including 5 Victoria Crosses. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Holden Beatty received the Victoria Cross for ramming the Campbelltown into the caisson gates. Commander Robert Ryder earned his for overall command of the naval forces. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman was recognised for his leadership of the commando forces ashore. Able seaman William Savage was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously for continuing to man his gun despite mortal wounds. Sergeant Thomas Durrant received his Victoria Cross posthumously for fighting his motor launch's gun until killed, having been wounded multiple times. These awards represented more than individual heroism. They acknowledged that the entire operation had been conducted at a level of sacrifice and determination that transcended normal military expectations. The raid also validated the entire concept of combined operations, joint planning between naval, army, and air forces to achieve objectives impossible for any single service. The concept of using explosive-laden vessels as guided weapons was refined and deployed again at Normandy. The commando tactics, small teams with specific objectives, synchronized to overwhelm defenses through simultaneity rather than mass, became standard doctrine for special operations. Even the acceptance of mission casualties in exchange for strategic gains was validated in a way that changed planning assumptions for future operations. The deeper revelation of Saint-Nazaire lies not in the tactical execution or even the strategic results, but in what it revealed about asymmetric warfare's potential. A force of 611 men, using obsolete equipment and accepting catastrophic casualties, achieved what conventional operations had failed to accomplish. They proved that vulnerable points existed even in seemingly impregnable defences, that careful planning could overcome vast numerical superiority, and that strategic effects could be achieved through precision action rather than overwhelming force. These lessons would echo through military doctrine for decades, validating concepts that would evolve into modern special operations forces. The prisoners left in the town were dismayed to see that the Campbelltown did not blow up on schedule. The Germans treated the British fighters well, probably in honour of their bravery for having attacked a fortress at 10-1 odds. Yet this respect did not extend to all captured commandos in the war. Under the Kommandobefehl, many would face execution rather than prisoner of war status. The Saint-Nazaire prisoners were fortunate to have been captured before the order's full implementation, though the raid itself was one of the primary catalysts for Hitler's unprecedented directive. When the survivors of Saint-Nazaire returned to Britain, they were met with celebration and disbelief. The British public, starved for good news after years of defeats and retreats, embraced the raid as evidence that Britain could strike back. But the propaganda value paled beside the concrete strategic achievement. The destruction of the Normandie dry dock significantly hampered German naval operations and proved that even the most heavily defended targets could be struck with skill and determination. The raid's strategic return on investment, measured in resources freed for other operations, exceeded the cost by orders of magnitude. The Nazaire raid stands among the most consequential special operations of World War II, not because it was the largest or involved the most troops, but because it achieved a strategic effect completely disproportionate to its size. A single dock, destroyed in a single night, changed the naval balance of the entire Atlantic theatre. A single raid, combined with incidents at Dieppe and Sark, provoked Hitler to issue an order that would later be prosecuted as a war crime at Nuremberg. A single operation validated an entirely new approach to warfare that would echo through military doctrine for the next 80 years. The Commandos who sailed towards Saint-Nazaire that March night knew they were likely sailing to their deaths. What they couldn't know was that they were also sailing into history, that their sacrifice would save countless lives by neutralizing Germany's most dangerous battleship, and that their audacity, combined with other commando operations, would so enrage the enemy's leader that he would issue orders damning himself and his regime with documentation that would serve as evidence at war crimes trials. The raid was audacious, the casualties were devastating. The results changed the course of the war, and Hitler's response made it immortal.